Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Joseph, the Vice President of Market Development here at ShareVault, and I'd like to welcome you to another one of our many life sciences-specific web panel discussions. Over the past few years, we've hosted webinars and web panels discussing licensing and partnering, valuation models, some hot topics such as immuno-oncology and gene therapies, but today's web panel is our first that's focused on the experiences, challenges, and suggestions for taking a life sciences company from founding to exit. The amazing number of signups we've had for this event clearly reflects a lot of interest in the topic. Before we start the panel discussion, I'm just going to spend a moment covering some logistical items and acknowledging our co-sponsors, and then I'll introduce you to Caroline Hodemaker, our moderator, who will introduce the panel. As a quick reminder, this is a 90-minute event, but if you need to leave before the end of the webinar, please don't worry about missing anything, as it is being recorded. We expect that there will be lots of questions, so during the discussion, if you have any questions you would like the panel to address, please submit them at any time through the questions box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll certainly try to get to as many of them as we can. Also, as I mentioned a moment ago, in case you can't stay for the whole discussion, the web panel is being recorded and you'll be able to come back and catch the rest of it in the next few days. And to make it easy, we'll send you an email notice when the recording and the slides for this event are available. Our first sponsor is the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, the organizer and host of the upcoming BioInvestor Forum taking place in San Francisco on October 17th and 18th. If you're not yet familiar with it, the BioInvestor Forum is an international biotech investor conference focused on early stage and established private companies, as well as emerging public companies. The event features company presentations, plenary sessions, business roundtables, and BIO's one-on-one partnering meetings. At last year's BioInvestor Forum, over 2,100 partnering meetings were scheduled, and I'm not surprised to hear that partnering is already poised for another record-breaking year. I'd encourage you to visit bio.org for more information and to register and attend this event, especially if you haven't done that in the past. Today's webinar is also sponsored by Women in Bio, which is an organization of professionals committed to promoting careers, leadership, and entrepreneurship for women in the life sciences. Women in Bio's members work in biopharma and medtech, at universities and institutes, in law and accounting firms, marketing and PR firms, at CROs and CMOs, and many of the organization's members are entrepreneurs, which is why a focus on entrepreneurship has remained core to the mission of Women in Bio since its founding in 2002. Because this event relates directly to the mission, Women in Bio and its executive director, Jamie Strakota, have been eager to sponsor it, and so we very much appreciate their involvement and support. Thank you, Jamie. Today's web panel is hosted by ShareVault, which is a leading provider of secure document sharing systems and virtual data rooms that are used for sharing highly confidential documents with external parties. ShareVault systems are very commonly used by companies, even startups and very young organizations, along with research and tech transfer organizations for controlling and monitoring activity of their sensitive documents that are being shared with investors, with potential partners, consultants, scientific advisory board members, boards of directors, and others. And because of its security, document control, and monitoring capabilities, being the only system of its kind with biopharma-specific features, and for having customers in 48 countries, ShareVault has been chosen to be the preferred provider for the member savings programs of Bio and 45 other international and regional life science associations. ShareVault is actually also frequently recognized for the valuable and topical webinars we sponsor, such as the one today, and for the quality of the white papers we publish based on these webinars. We're now ready to start the main event, From Founding to Exit, a Life Science Business Founder Perspective. Our moderator, Caroline Hodemaker, has over 25 years of experience in the life sciences industry, working with companies in the device, pharmaceutical, and diagnostic arenas, always focused on introducing novel technologies. Prior to establishing a consulting practice in 2002, Caroline worked for a number of cutting-edge companies in laparoscopic surgery, point-of-care diagnostics, and matrix-based soft tissue replacement composites, as well as working with J&J Ethicon. While at J&J, Caroline ran deal teams that strategized focus areas, identified, managed, and led due diligence on companies targeted for license or acquisition. Caroline's consulting firm, Valued Solutions, has worked with large companies such as J&J, Daiichi Sankyo, and Stryker, startups such as Tyrex, which was acquired by Medtronic, and other companies such as Prometheus Diagnostics, Sillogene, and WebCures. 4 years ago, Caroline founded the TTAP Accelerator Program, which she'll now tell you a little about. Caroline, thank you for proposing and developing today's topic, for identifying and recruiting our panelists, and for leading the upcoming discussion. The podium is yours.
Thank you, Steve. I wanted to tell our audience a little bit about the TTAP. So the TTAP is really a life science focused accelerator, focused really on the. Hello? Yeah.
Yeah, it's your event now.
Focusing on life science acceleration, focused on accelerating life science companies with the premise that these businesses really work together best as teams, and promoting the discovery and development of highly valuable scientific innovation, which progresses most effectively when multiple skill sets work together. This is a cohort that we've been working on for several years and really is now taking off. But today, the exciting part is we get to talk with several serial CEOs who have worked as founders all the way to the exit. Just as a little flat top of the Founders to Exit is the first of two panel discussions. This one is from the business side, and then further, either later this year or early next year, we're going to run another panel, which will be from the scientific founder perspective. So stay tuned for that. But each of the CEO panelists were custom selected for the day for their depth of experience from their business side, and to bring in different perspectives and different set of experiences. Thus, we have CEOs from therapeutics, topical, and device perspectives. The discussion today will walk through the life cycle of an early stage science company with a focus slightly on the business and financial side rather than the scientific side, and the implications that means. We'll start with the founding and the initial funding challenges, walk through some critical factors and the pivots that have to take place along the way, talk about the subsequent impact on the subsequent fundings, and then talk a little bit about the exit. But before we get into the panel discussion, I would like to have each of the panelists introduce themselves and provide some background on one of the companies so that we set the stage. Wendy, would you start?
Yes, thank you so much, Caroline. I really appreciate being here today. I'm Wendy Perro, CEO of Asclepics Therapeutics. And in my career, I've been very fortunate to work for both large pharmaceutical companies and small biotechs. I started my career at Johnson & Johnson and then moved to Merck, where I spent 14 years with Merck globally. I got married in 2003 and moved to the Baltimore, Maryland area and started in the small biotech world. I worked at Sigma-Tau Pharmaceuticals, where we transformed that company into one of the first orphan drug companies in the country. I then worked at Alba Therapeutics and was CEO there, and I'm currently CEO of Asclepics Therapeutics. I've been really fortunate to launch breakthrough products that have really saved millions of lives globally at Merck. First with Zocor to reduce cholesterol, then with Veravax, the first vaccine to prevent chickenpox, and then with Cozar-Hyzar, the first ARB for hypertension. And we've been able to put together mega trials that really show prevention of heart attacks, strokes, and very, very good outcomes data with these products. I've also, during my career, been really fortunate to live in many countries and work in many countries around the world. I've worked in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and the United States. And I believe this has helped really shape me as a global business leader and to think about the issues not only in the U.S., but also how this affects a product globally. Next slide. I've chosen Alba Therapeutics to talk about some lessons in entrepreneurship. And liraglutide acetate will be the first medicine for celiac disease. Alba was formed in 2005, and a preclinical asset was licensed from the University of Maryland at that time. I joined the company in 2008, and I was the Vice President of Marketing and Business Development at that time. We had 4 venture capital firms in the company, And one of the lessons that I've learned is that really and truly this is probably the most important thing that you do, and that is work with really good partners for investment. This is a marriage. I was at the company for 8.5 years, and my VC partners were my bosses, mentors, and friends for 8.5 years. And their investment was $45 million into the company, and obviously my goal was to bring the medicine to the market and to get them an exit. We also had pharmaceutical partnerships that put $55 million of investment into the company. This is a very nice way to take a product forward because the burden of clinical trials over time, cost-wise, gets very high. And in 2011, February 10th, 2011, I successfully closed a deal with Cephalon for the product. And unfortunately, just before the deal was closed, the CEO passed away, the company was put in play and was acquired. And so that changed the dynamics of our deal structure. In the course of ALBA, we conducted 7 clinical trials in 828 patients with celiac disease, and we completed 25 toxicology studies, everything that is required for the NDA. There is no approved medicine for celiac disease anywhere around the world. So when I came on, it became a big challenge to create an endpoint. There was no regulatory path, no endpoint for celiac disease. And so we partnered with the FDA and SEALD for 6 years to create a new celiac disease patient-reported outcome instrument. And we have gained approval of that instrument, and we're the only second new PRO to be approved as a primary endpoint by the FDA since the 2009 SEALD guidelines. It was a major accomplishment, and it will be the standard most likely for celiac disease trials going forward and endpoints in that patient population. I then ran a phase 2B clinical trial with erazotide acetate. It was 342 patients. We were over-enrolled 2 months early and $1 million under budget, which helped us as we went to then get another deal for the company. And the best news of all, erazotide acetate was superior to the gluten-free diet. It's the only product that has ever beaten the gluten-free diet and was a very successful clinical trial. Again, in lessons, be sure that you preserve cash, that you have persistence when you have a good product, and don't give up. And lastly, what made the investors very happy is I had an exit and closed a deal with Innovate Biopharmaceuticals to take erazotide acetate to phase 3 clinical trials and FDA submission. That occurred February of 2016. We went to the FDA this January for the end of phase 2 meeting, and the phase 3 clinical trials should start early 2018. So it was quite a ride and a very great experience.
Wendy, thank you for that concise background, and really helped set the stage for the panel. Robert, perhaps you could go next.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. My name is Robert Alonso. I'm currently the founding CEO of a company called Mitocon Pharmaceuticals, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. Similar to Wendy, my career began in big pharma. We were both at Merck together, funny enough. And I was trained really on the commercial side, and then moved from anti-infective marketing into doing licensing and business development, and that's where I got my first foray or taste of what biotech was all about. And I realized that being an entrepreneur and moving into small companies was the place that I really wanted to be. So in 2002, I founded a company called Septeris Therapeutics, which I'll go into more detail on the next slide. But ran the company for 10 years, raised over $50 million. We had multiple INDs and one NDA that was eventually approved, and did the largest study in cutaneous lymphoma. My current company, Mitocon Pharmaceuticals, was founded in 2014. And it's a company that's focused on neurodegenerative diseases that specifically address aging. Our compounds modulate the mitochondria, and our thesis is that as you age, your mitochondria become dysfunctional, and there's a lot of research that supports this. And what our drugs do is promote cellular resilience and protection. We've got exceptionally strong data, which looks like the drugs are disease modifying in Huntington's disease, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, also in hearing loss. We've just completed all the phase 1 ready toxicology work and about to file the IND later this year. To date, we've raised about $3.5 million in seed round with mostly high net worth individuals. We've got $1 million coming from non-dilutive sources, mostly from foundations now, such as like the Michael J. Fox Foundation, which we just closed with. And we're currently in the midst of trying to raise a Series A, which will be roughly a $15 million raise that'll take us through phase 1 and phase 2, proof of concept. Next slide, please. So in terms of my experience, you know, my first company was started in 2002, and as most of us will tell you that, you know, whatever you start the company with, it usually ends up something very different. So originally it was built as a university spin-off, University of Kentucky. I partnered with 2 professors there. One was a chemist, one was a pharmacologist, and we focused on diseases of addiction. And the thesis was that we would use significant capital from the NIH because NIDA was supporting the programs, and we'd raise seed financing from high net worth individuals. So you can see we raised $6 million in seed, and $5 million came from the NIH. But probably 4 years into the company, an opportunity knocked, and we're a skin cancer product that was originally being compounded in pharmacies. Fox Chase Cancer Center came to me with this idea, and we realized that if we could create a new formulation, for those of you who don't know, compounded drugs are not approved by the FDA, but if we can get it approved by the FDA, we can switch 100% of the business from the compounding over to the company. And especially if we can establish IP, then we could sell the company and make everybody a significant amount of money. Over that time frame, you know, we had to work with the agency. We had 5 years of development work, including a special protocol assessment, which took 1.5 years on its own, but was well worth it. And we can go into more details about that in the question and answer session. And we ran a multi-phase site phase 3 study, which was the largest study ever done in cutaneous T-cell lymphoma. Eventually, in 2013, after the drug was approved with positive phase 3 data, it was sold to Actelion Pharmaceuticals for $250 million, which provided about a 7 to 8 times money back for the investors. So, you know, this was for me, it was a fabulous experience, you know, going from a large pharmaceutical environment into a small company where you had to learn pretty much on the fly. But one of the things, the greatest lesson I learned was that you needed to know what you didn't know, because there's plenty of experts out there that know a great deal. This is a significantly complicated business, and to know that and to go get the right people is critical to success. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And now, Rick, if you could introduce yourself. I think we'll tell the 3 of them actually have really nice, similar but different backgrounds.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Rick Hewen. I'm the medical device diagnostics person on the panel, so your non-therapeutics person. I've been doing it for about 30 years, and half a career in Fortune 500 companies, Abbott, Becton Dickinson, Johnson & Johnson, and then half a career in startups, basically. So first, my very first startup was this little software medical play called LearnWare. Basically e-learning, e-marketing for pharmaceutical and medical device firms. And we built that up and over the course of about 4 years, and sold it to a private equity firm. And what I'm going to talk about today, when we get to the next slide, is a CSA Medical device that we licensed from technology that we licensed from the Navy, and took that through the device commercialization process. I currently am CEO of Self Systems. Self is a university licensed technology where we are commercializing a novel circulating tumor cell technology to identify the ideal drug on patient-specific basis. So to be able to screen a panel of approved or non-approved drugs, again, on a personalized patient-specific basis, and pick the best one for patient A at that course in their therapy. So that's what I'm doing currently. That company is only a year and a half old, so there's not a whole lot of history that's all that interesting to talk about yet. And I'll be talking about CSA Medical, which is on the next slide. So CSA Medical, I'll reserve most of this for the balance of the talk, but it's an interesting history, and I put the timeline up there to give you a perspective of the type of marathon run that this is. But it was originally licensed from National Naval Medical Center when it was national, before it was Walter Reed, the combined center between Walter Reed and Navy, and went through animal data and patents issued and moving from one company to the next. Actually went through 3 different company names before it became CSA Medical. And it was in the early 2000s when the technology really started to move. And fundamentally what it is using liquid nitrogen inside the body the way a dermatologist would use liquid nitrogen outside the body. So the good news for us is we didn't have to wonder whether it worked or not. It was very well established in the field of medicine. The challenge was you're trying to move something that boils at minus 200 degrees into a plus 100 degree vessel. So 300 degree swing, and you have a tremendous physics and engineering challenge to use liquid nitrogen inside the body for gastrointestinal tumors and eventually airway tumors. And you can see the timeline there. What you don't see in the mid-2000s, there's 4 line items that are invisible there, and they all read exactly the same, which is ran out of money, broke. So in between those successful rounds, fundraising rounds, Series A, Series B, Series C, substantial raises of money, was the classic startup conundrum of minimal cash, in a few cases down to zero, and managing that bridge from no cash to the next successful round. And we'll talk more about that later. Thanks.
Next slide. So today's discussion should be provocative and educational with different perspectives on the same issue. How do we get from foundation to exit? From a rare disease, a topical therapeutic, and a device-based company, all coming from different types of sources, some the Navy, some academics, and having founders join those companies at different stages. We're really privileged to have a panel that can share their advice and personal stories, and we encourage you to ask questions along the way, but we are most likely going to need to respond to them at the end of the session. With that, we'll get right into it as we go from foundation and initial challenges through to the exit. Next slide. So we'll start out the discussion with questions about how these businesses started out and what was important and some of the early stage challenges. So let's start with the beginning. You know, just as an open-ended question, what does it take to get started? What are some of the challenges that you experienced in getting this formed? Perhaps, Robert, if we could start with you.
Sure. So from my perspective, getting started is you really need to find someone or a group of people, especially from me, who is more on the business side. You need to find the scientists that have exciting and interesting science that you think has a chance of success, and then I think critically and importantly that you can get along with, because as you can see from all of our timelines, this doesn't happen over a year or two. It happens over many years and even a decade. So you're talking to these people every day and working with them every day, and the last thing you want to do is work with people you don't get along with. So really, when my current company, what I looked for was I wanted to do something that I thought could be transformational, because my last company was successful and I had the freedom to operate there. The drug was really a repurposed drug in the first instance, my first company, and this time I really wanted to do something I felt was going to have a major impact, if successful, on diseases, and that's why we're focused on rare neurodegenerative diseases where there's really no treatments. So that was critically important to me, and then, as I said before, it was really important that I found scientists and people that I could work with that I really enjoyed being with on a regular day-to-day basis.
Wendy, what about you? Would you make some comments?
Yes, certainly. Well, in my current company, I worked with the two founders as a business advisor for 2 years before I joined their team as a CEO. And this really helped us ensure there was trust, mutual respect, and that we were really a good fit as a team because as Robert says, you really live together for many, many years. It's really important that you trust each other. And the most important thing to me after finding those compatible scientists is to ensure that this technology or the products that you have is the best science out there. It's very hard to spend all the years and all of the things that go into being an entrepreneur when you've got something that's not novel and that fulfills an unmet medical need. So that was the second thing that I really felt was important. And then third was be sure that when you're starting up, you get some cash and you preserve that cash because having enough money is always a challenge.
Richard, you made some comments about some of the efforts in our earlier discussions, about some of the efforts that you found in that initial stage where you're beginning to work with a scientific founder on the efforts that you need to do. Could you comment on that?
Sure. You may have seen in the earlier slide, I spend about a day a month at Hopkins in their tech transfer office and 2 or 3 days a month in the University of Maryland, similar office. And I spend a lot of time with inventors, physicians, PhDs, MD, PhDs, who have, brilliant inventions. And the first thing I'm always trying to help them figure out, and what I have had to figure out for myself with both CSA Medical and now Self Systems is, does the dog hunt? And the reality is that most don't. And what I mean by that is, does it serve a passionate market need, not a little bit of an improvement or this would be better than, because those don't fly typically. Or those are incremental improvements that are the type of thing that a Johnson & Johnson or an Abbott or a Merck can push through the system. But for a startup, kind of echoing a little bit about what Wendy said, you really need something that is dramatically different, dramatically better, both clinically and financially for the market you're going into. And then you really need to do a deep dive from a market research standpoint and really, really understand the big market, the sub-markets, the competition, the milieu of variables that you're eventually going to go to war with, and understand, again, does this dog hunt or not? And that's what I spend so much time trying to ferret through, and getting inventors and investors to look candidly in the mirror and be able to accept the fact that it just may not. And the reality is 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 don't. And that's not a sin. That just means you need to move on and find the next great thing.
You commented a little bit on some of the tools that you use to get around those hurdles and get people to think a little bit objectively. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think you're talking about, market data tools. There's a plethora of them out there. Everybody on this call gets emails galore from different vendors selling market research reports. And those are great to give you the 10,000 foot or the macro level. What I find is seldom done, though, is digging down, it's always a $1 billion market or a $2 billion market. And the reality is those markets aren't markets. They're subdivided into dozens, if maybe not 100, sub-markets, both clinically, financially, and logistically. So you really need to dig in with your experts who are delivering this care directly to the patient and understand how that parsecs out. And then I force myself and others to build a market model, and that's just getting behind an Excel spreadsheet and beating through the realistic numbers of how many widgets could actually be sold in the future, to whom, and why will they pay for them. And just being really, really honest with yourself and doing the exercise with the acceptance that when you're done, it may not work, it may not float, and you may have to move on.
So a little bit, it would be interesting to understand a little bit, as you guys are joining these companies, where is their mindset? Where do they think the funding is going to come from? What was the experience before you came onto the team? Perhaps, Robert, if you could comment a little bit.
Yeah, I think a lot of times people think that if you have a great idea, people are just going to throw money at it, and it's a hard lesson to realize that there's so many ideas, and especially when you start going for institutional investors, they're just inundated with business plans that, the key is to try to drive it to the top. So I think expectations, especially with scientific founders, is to give them a chance that they should understand the expectations. Yeah, it might be great, but there's probably 100 great things that this investor is looking at a certain period of time. So I think managing expectations is really important as you begin things.
Wendy, did you want to add something to that?
Yes, I found with my current company, helping the founders understand that what it takes to get a product to the next level will not be sufficient if they just go with SBIR grants. And that's definitely not enough money to move a novel product forward. And to understand time is money, and the market can change rapidly while you're just chasing SBIR grants. So in order to move your technology forward as soon as possible and climb over those hurdles of a changing market, get the best product, and then have the best story and investor presentation you can to get the investors excited in novel technology. Because if it's not novel, chances are you won't be looked at and you won't get funding.
So just curious, but if we could go through the top panel, perhaps Richard, Robert, then Wendy. Where were the companies that you were involved in, the companies that we profiled? Where were they funded before you joined the company? How were they funded? So Richard, how was CSA funded before you joined the company?
Sure. So it started with, like most companies, friends and family, and pretty much anybody that we could convince of our story. So by the time we got to our A round of funding, we had 80 private investors. So that was a lot. Tiny sums from 10 or 20,000 up to, significant funds of, 200,000 plus, all cobbled together to keep the company alive in those formative years prior to a Series A fund. And then our first Series A, go ahead.
Sorry, Richard, did you join them before their Series A or after their Series A?
Before.
Yeah. So at the founding of the company, before you were brought on board, did they have the family and friends on board already, or were they just grant funded?
I see. So the technology was originally grant funded when the inventor, a brilliant physician, Dr. Mark Johnston, previously at the Navy, now in private practice. So that was a lot of military R01, R21 type grants. When we actually formed CSA Medical out of its predecessor, CRIMED, the very first batch of funding that we secured was a CRADA, Cooperative Research and Development Agreement, with Walter Reed, and did our, some of our early work there. So at that time, we were assembling that gaggle, if you will, of individual investors. So when I came on board, I don't know the exact number, but there was maybe half a dozen investors into the company for those early days, and then we went from 6 to 80 plus the CRADA to get it on its feet and do our first human work.
So Wendy, where was it when you joined the company? Were they still at the grant founding stage, or had they brought in friends and family?
Yes, Asclepics Therapeutics has a very clean cap table, which is really nice. It had $6.3 million in non-dilutive funding through the SBIR and grants from the Coulter Foundation, the Tome Foundation. Since I've joined, we've now just raised $2 million in non-dilutive funding. So a total of $8.3 million non-dilutive funding has gone into the company. I'm now raising my Series A of 18 to 24 million that will complete the talks in the phase 1/2 clinical trial for the eye, some work on cancer and transplant.
And is that similar for Alba?
When I joined Alba?
Yes.
It's very different than Alba. When I joined Alba, they already had the 4 venture capital firms in place, and then I had to get partnerships along with the founders and the pharmaceutical founders and pharmaceutical companies to get additional funding along with the investors. So it was a very different play than Asclepics Therapeutics.
Robert, what about you?
So yeah, I'm a little different. So I tend to found companies. I look for companies that are in science that it hasn't even been. I look for companies that haven't even been formed, and then I form them. So I'm really out there hunting for technology that I think has legs, or as Rick said, that a dog that hunts, and I like that, by the way. And so that's my thing. And then what I like to do is, I have a group of high net worth individuals who have made a lot of money with me in the past, so that was useful in my current company. And then one of the things I really think is important, and we're all talking about these non-dilutive sources, and I think that's, for most companies, it's critical to get some non-dilutive capital into the company, because not only is it help you along, the problem is it usually just pays for the science. It doesn't pay for any of the general and administrative type of stuff. It doesn't pay for lawyers and all these other things. So you need additional capital. But what it really does, when you get someone like who we just got the Michael J. Fox Foundation on board, and they're the preeminent institution in Parkinson's disease, and it really validates your technology. In my last company, we also had a CRADA with the National Institute for Drug Abuse, and those guys are, they're not putting millions of dollars in because they don't think the science is excellent. So I think it does 2 things for a company, especially when you're starting out. It provides the validation, and it provides the cash to kind of drive that science in those early days where it's very difficult to get, institutional investors interested in a preclinical asset.
So as we move on to the next slide and we talk a little bit about critical factors and hurdles, that's a perfect transition, which is, you got to transition these companies from sort of grant thinking to commercial thinking. And what do you do to get them in that transition? Are there key pieces that, either with any of your companies that you've worked with, that you really had to think about that, and how you've had to transition them from really changing their mindset? I don't know, Robert, if you want to just continue for a little bit on that?
Sure, yeah. So I think as I said earlier in my first slide, my first company when we started, was a university spin out focused on addictions. We had this CRADA with NIDA, and we had a lot of non-dilutive funding. We also had some high net worth people in, but all of a sudden this opportunity appeared that was like, hey, you can have a phase 3 asset if the FDA lets you, right, go through the clinical studies. And so it was like, that was like a big change. And we said, this is just a golden opportunity that you can't overlook. So at least you had to explore it. And as soon as we went to the FDA, you know, we did a pre-IND document, and they actually invited us down there at the time, which was unusual. And we had a discussion, and the first words out of their mouth was, we've been waiting for somebody to do this. I mean, which was unusual for the FDA. And that was like a big change. And that really, you know, when you see opportunities appear, and it might be a little offset of where your company is, it still might be the right thing to do. And that transformed the company. We all of a sudden were working with the FDA through a special protocol assessment. We were then opened the doors for, you know, venture capital, because now we had a late stage asset. So it was one of those, you know, transformative moves. And, you know, my current company, you know, I think we raised the initial financing with the idea that we were going to see if the technology worked. And we got, there's a funder in Pennsylvania called Ben Franklin Technology Partners, and they were, you know, they're a state kind of quasi venture fund, but it comes from the state money. And it was important. They do diligence, they do all the things that a normal institutional investor will do. And the idea was, you know, they believed in the technology because it was focused on mitochondria. It was a hot topic, and they believed in me and the team that we could get it done. And, you know, fast forward 2 years later, and now we have, you know, we're ready to start human clinical studies that could really revolutionize the field of neurodegeneration. So I think the learnings that I've had is that, you know, you got to always keep your eyes open for where the opportunities are, and move your company. You got to be extremely nimble to be able to move in the right direction.
So Wendy, along that line, one of the things you talked about in our earlier discussions was about figuring out what they had. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. Well, I sat down for 6 months after I joined the company to really delve into what the company had and what kind of science they really had. And I had to ensure there was a strategic plan going forward of the technology, the competition, what's the commercialization look like, what do payers do in this marketplace, and what kind of potential pharmaceutical partners are for an exit. And then I wrote the business plan and found out that, much to my surprise, they had thought that they just had a product for the eye and to prevent blindness for diabetic macular edema and wet AMD with this really novel mechanism of action. They did indeed have that, and do have that. That's pretty transformative. They also have a product and backup compounds in all categories for 4 orphan cancers. So that became another part of the story. And then they had another family and compound of products that are for transplant to prevent rejection. And these are all novel, all really transformative products, very unique. And it has resonated once I put the entire portfolio together and created the business plan. It's resonating very, very well with investors. But again, that took about 6 months to pull that together and to understand really what does the company have. And even with me being involved previously, I didn't understand the full scientific rigor that they've gone through in the company.
Can you comment perhaps a little bit on how the investors perceived that as you brought back the onion skin, and how you brought that to the investors for presentation and conversation?
Well, what's nice about the portfolio, having, and it's very similar to what I learned at Merck, having a main compound and backup compounds in unique therapeutic areas that really address an unmet medical need resonates well, both in the scientific field as well as with investors. And what was really nice about having a portfolio of products in different therapeutic areas, and we organized the company as an LLC, so an investor could invest in the entire corporation, all 3 different areas, or we could take a C Corp down from the LLC, and they could invest in just the eye if they would like, or they could just invest in cancer, or they could just invest in transplant. And this gives very attractive options for different exits for the investors. So this really has resonated well, both in the scientific community and with investors.
Great. Well, some of the other operational issues that we talked about earlier were things like regulatory and how that's different, particularly for the different sectors. Richard, do you want to start with that a little bit? Just sort of things that you experienced along the way and how it's a challenge?
Sure. My world's, I think, a good bit simpler than Wendy's and Robert's, because everything we were doing in the early days of CSA Medical was all 510K devices. And so really the first question in that world is there a predicate or not? And as I said earlier, liquid nitrogen was such a ubiquitous compound in medicine. There was a plethora of devices that have in some way, shape, or form touched liquid nitrogen. So we had a veritable cocktail of predicate devices and did what pretty much all device firms that are chasing the 510K would do, is hire somebody who has worked at the FDA in this process or run numerous products successfully through the process, and chart that path, both logistically but also financially. You have to make sure you have enough cash to get there. So, and understand the clinical burden of proof, again, much lower than what Wendy and Robert have to go through. And we did exactly that. And we went down and met with the FDA and told them our plan, and they gave us feedback. We adjusted it, and we ran our first clinical trial at the Cleveland Clinic. And that was the data that we used along with earlier data bundled together to get our very first clearance in way back in 2004. So pretty straightforward. A little bit later, when what actually caused us to go for a C round of funding is we did some very good science from a pathology standpoint, and we got a little bit lucky. We listened to somebody in the pulmonology community and found that our device might have application in the lung, where we were spending the previous years completely focused on the GI system. And long story short, found out that was true and that we could actually go for a therapeutic indication, which sent us on the PMA path, the path that Wendy and Robert live with, to use our device for actually what's currently being pursued, an indication for chronic bronchitis.
So Wendy, I think you had a little different than regulatory experience than Robert and Richard had.
Yes, well, one of the challenges that we had in creating a product and a market for celiac disease is that no one understood celiac disease, and a lot of people thought that celiac disease was just an allergy to wheat. You can just eat the wheat. It's no big deal. Well, it turns out that celiac disease is an autoimmune condition. It's genetic, and it leads to cancer. It's a very serious condition, and there was no path, no regulatory path, no experience with the FDA, and they didn't even understand celiac disease. So when it came time to talk to them over 10 full years about the disease state, the guidance that we got over the 10-year period was all over the place. When I finally came on board and led the company, it became clear that FDA wanted us to create a patient-reported outcome, and that's a very challenging thing to do. It's an instrument that is newly created for a disease state. You have to do qualitative research with patients and doctors and key opinion leaders, and then you have to do a lot of work with an outside group called Evidera, who was fantastic, and you have to partner with FDA and SEALD. They have changed the name of that group now, but we partnered with the GI division and Donna Grable and the SEALD division, Electra there, for 6 years. And we did everything they asked us to do. We did all of the work that was required. It took 6 years, millions of dollars, but we had 6 meetings with the FDA in 1 year. One meeting was just to educate the FDA team on what is celiac disease by key opinion leaders. And you know, you only get 1 hour in an FDA meeting. So we were at the FDA 6 times in 1 year, educating and working toward getting this new PRO instrument. The most wonderful thing happened when we did use it to validate it in the clinical trial, and it was validated, and FDA agreed that it was validated. So this instrument will live long beyond me and will help celiac disease patients for a very long time with clinical trials both now and in the future. So it really taught me that being a partner, don't get frustrated, because of course they have a job to do. They want to ensure medicine is safe first and effective. And if you partner with them and have all of your meetings in the right path and you have a wonderful regulatory lead, you can be successful together.
So if we can move to the next slide. All of these are really news-sounding and interesting events that each of you had to manage along the way, where you were managing the unexpected. We're going to sort of talk a little bit about, you know, what happens when you receive some of these newsworthy situations and how you manage them. I'm just thinking, perhaps, Robert, can you talk about some of the crazy things that happened to you with the clinical trial?
Sure. So first I want to congratulate Wendy going through that process, because I think it's very difficult for investors to get on board when you've got to try to create a new instrument through validation. You know, I think from looking at starting companies and where to go, you know, it's much easier, obviously, to go with an indication as a clear regulatory path. But so anyway, I just wanted to say it's amazing, Wendy, that you did that. Secondly, from a regulatory perspective, you know, I had my last company, you know, whenever you deal with the FDA, you always get these crazy things that happen. And just as a story, we had, as I said earlier, a special protocol assessment, which means it's a contractual agreement between you and the agency that if you hit the endpoint, that they'll agree that the study was done successfully. I mean, they still don't have to approve it, but it usually happens. But so we had but everything in that protocol has to remain the same. So anyway, we were realizing as we were moving through the study that the study may be underpowered because we were losing patients, and we had to increase the numbers. And so we asked for, I think it was a type A meeting, which is a 30-day window, and they granted it. We went down there, discussed the situation, and they agreed that that would be the best scenario, just, you know, increase the patient numbers. And so we came back, and we did an amendment and sent it in, and before we got the minutes back, but we had our own minutes, and we referred to the meeting. And then, you know, within, like, I don't know, a couple of days, we get this note back that says that your special protocol assessment is now null and void because you've increased the patient numbers. So you can imagine that was like the critical piece in the company, and everyone was going absolutely bonkers. The board was crazy because they were like, what happened? And we were like totally blindsided. And luckily, we had a good relationship. That was critically important. We were able to pick up the phone and say, hey, where did this come from? We agreed that this was going to happen. And we had to wait for 30 days. They verbally told us, don't worry about it, but we had to wait literally 30 days before they would reissue it and tell us everything was okay. In the meantime, everybody's on pins and needles. So it's one of those things, you know, that happens. I mean, there's many stories everyone can tell of just dealing with the agency and having to overcome issues that arise. I mean, at the end of the day, they're you know, Wendy's right. Their main job is to protect the patients, but there's also a bunch of bureaucrats there that really look at different things and stay in their silos, and in this case was one of them, and it really was a topsy-turvy time for the company.
Just trying to talk about maybe some other challenges that you experienced and had to hit and manage and change, particularly when it brought sort of negative news or specifically positive news back to the investors. Wendy, could you give us an example?
I guess the hardest thing that I've ever been through was the financial crisis of 2008. It was extremely difficult to get through this time period. As Rick had said earlier, there was no money to get. Most companies failed, closed the doors because they couldn't get further money. I was very fortunate that our investors believed in us and were very supportive, even as you say, Robert, because it was challenging to do the PRO. They were very supportive of the PRO, and that's something I'm very grateful about. They provided a bridge loan to get me to close with the pharmaceutical partnership, and were very supportive and always in my camp and always in the company's camp. So I learned from that it's extremely important to get the right board, the right investors with the right trust, and treat their money very, very carefully, just like you would in your very own bank account. And because of that wonderful partnership, we were then able to get the bridge loan and get to the next deal, and then complete the last trial and get that final exit for the investors. But it was a really tough time.
Rich, you talked a little bit earlier about the fact that you had an opportunity in the GI area, GI versus airway. Do you want to talk about how perhaps that's on the positive side, how that news came in and how then it was delivered to the investor community and how they responded?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. We're kind of in our own little GI tunnel and not really looking for other things to do because our plate was full. And we had an interventional pulmonologist come to us and say, hey, I want to use your device in the lungs. And our instinct was, well, no, you can't do that. A little science fact, liquid nitrogen expands 700 to 1 ratio. So little 1 cc of liquid nitrogen creates the equivalent of like a liter Coke bottle full of gas. So you really have to manage that when it's inside the body, obviously. And in the GI system, it's relatively easy because you just put a tube down or up and hook suction up to it and you pull the gas out. It's not a big deal. In the airway, whole different story, less space, more fragile. And we said it can't happen. We actually went to some of the GI opinion leaders and they said, no. We went to the inventor, said, don't do it. And the pulmonologist said, I'll prove you wrong. So we went to the animal lab at Cleveland Clinic, got set up in the surgery suite, and long story short, he was right. He proved us wrong, that it absolutely could work, did work. And the downside, the gas management issue could be managed if you know what you're doing and you're careful. Along with some engineering changes to the device. So long story short, it took us from this kind of little boutique market, esophageal cancer of 16,000 cases a year, into the lung cancer market of 250,000 cases per year. And then that is what, as I mentioned earlier, with some good science and a little bit of luck, got us into potential markets of chronic refractory asthma and chronic bronchitis with millions and millions of patients per year. So it was all due to good listening, albeit listening under duress at first. But the lesson there would be is, as focused as you have to be to keep things on the path and get things done, realize that focus can also be a big fat blind spot to opportunity.
That's great. And if we just go to the next slide. And we talk about getting to exit. We talk about all the challenges from the very beginning to the end. One of the things that all of your companies had to experience was the due diligence process and how it changes over time. I was wondering if you might comment a little bit on you know, give a little of your experience. Maybe we'll start with Wendy on which was the easiest due diligence and why, and how was it different from your later due diligence?
Well, I've always had very good luck with due diligence. I really believe in having a very strong due diligence room and having as much information and data in there as you possibly can for the teams that are going in to look for them. The more rigorous due diligence is always the pharmaceutical partner. They have many groups of people that have to look at all the different areas, so organize your data room by the therapeutic or area that they're going to be looking in. Tox is separate from clinical, from market research and competitive and all of that, and all your financials and corporate, all of those folders are really important for different parts. So it's really critical that you spend a lot of time creating the right due diligence room and organizing it so that it's easy for the investors to go through. And then later, if you're having an exit with a pharmaceutical partner, to make it very, very easy for their different departments to go into their area.
Were you working with the same investors at the beginning that you were working with at the end? And did that make it easier or harder?
Yes, I was working with the same group of 4 investors that started with the company for the entire time I was with the company. I found it to be very good. I liked it a lot. I think it depends on your therapeutic area if you're going to have to get more rounds. Like right now I'm in the eye space. I will probably have to get an initial round and then a much bigger round with a larger group of investors. But I did find that experience of the same ones to be very positive.
And Richard, I think you had some different experiences, and you've managed your investors along the way differently. Can you talk a little bit about that as well as the due diligence component?
Sure. I mean, the due diligence process is just brutal. The first one is just, it's painful. Putting all that information together that Wendy spoke of is very, very difficult. So if there's a lesson to learn is as you go from startup, be thinking about this due diligence process a couple years down, and just, you know, knit all of your references together and your market research data, and just keep it organized so you can know how to get to it. But when the time comes, the very first one is just so time consuming and brutal to do. One of the things that we had to do in our pursuit of the Series A, as I mentioned before, we had these 80 individual investors, and the incoming investor for the Series A is just not going to deal with, you know, 80 other entities or partners. So they were all bundled into a myself included, being one of those investors, bundled into a voting trust, where the voting trust then, you know, elected a 3-person board, and then one person on that board was the voting trust board was a member of the board for the company, and then all issues then channeled through one single person to represent the 80, which was a requirement, and I would say a logical requirement of the incoming investor to just clean up some of the complexity of the history to get to that point.
That's great. And then, Robert, I think you had, so Richard, can you talk about how your investors just changed from the beginning to the end, and how you sort of managed that, or what you did along the way to give new investors every round, or?
Richard or Robert?
I'm sorry, Richard. Rick.
Sure. So I just told you how the initial 80 investors were managed. So the Series A investor, lead investor, carried on to Series B, and then 2 new venture partners came in to carry the Series B. From B to C, all 3 participated with a new hospital consortium venture arm was the added component in the C. And the D is under construction as we speak. I'm not involved with that. I exited the company in the summer of 2015, and but my lead on the D round is to date will follow in that D round also, mainly because the potential exit being able to move into the airway and for these for a true clinical indication in these giant markets of bronchitis and COPD are attractive.
And Robert, you talked a little bit about not just managing the investors as they come and leave, but also managing the board and some of the things that you implemented along the way and how you've changed in what you do.
Yeah, so, I think as your board gets built out and you have, I mean, most private companies, the board consists of, the venture capitalists and I think it's important to have a strong chairman on your board that's integrated with the CEO and the management team. I mean, in our board meetings, the management team would present on a quarterly basis the updates of what was going on for the business, like most board meetings. My recommendation to anyone out there would be to really have a strong chairman that maybe is not related. Hopefully it would be someone who's independent and not related to the investor groups. To get back to your diligence question, the hardest diligence we ever faced was the corporate diligence. And I think once you do partnering, and I'm sure both Rick and Wendy will agree that the corporate guys bring, you're a small company of maybe 20, 25 people, and they bring in that many just for the diligence, and managing that's critically important. And managing, in the terms of the board, their expectations of what's happening with the diligence, because everybody's on pins and needles as you go, and this is, partnering diligence as you're going through partnering, because everybody wants the exit to happen. So, it's important to be upfront, honest, and, let the board know exactly what's happening. And when that process happened, the board communications were pretty much daily. Your job went from managing your company to pretty much managing the board in the process, was 90% of the time.
So are there other, perhaps Richard, you can comment a little bit more on when you actually get to the exit, when we get there, what's the most challenging part of the exit that you experience?
Interesting. The obvious negotiation on valuation. I mean, there's many different ways you can pose your valuation. Multiple of revenue, multiple of earnings, forward-looking, backward. It's a negotiation, and obviously the two parties have, because you're trying to exit. It's very different than moving from a B round to a C round, where your interests are reasonably aligned, not completely. You have to keep in mind that new money coming in and existing money in is looking for a larger share with each time, and a minimal evaluation sometimes. But on exit, whole different story. And it's a big rough negotiation onto what that valuation will be, and then the algebra behind it to support it.
And Wendy, you had a very interesting experience when you were exiting from Alba, and that really implicated the time that it took to close. You mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I think it's really interesting. Could you share that?
Yes, certainly. One of the things I've learned is that relationships are really critical as you move toward exit. Relationship with your investors and your board, and relationship with that partner company that you're going to exit with. And to expect the unexpected and work through any issues that come your way. We had a deal ready to close for Alba Therapeutics, and it was ready to close in October. The CEO got unexpectedly sick and passed away in August. So our deal that we had been working on together with them through due diligence for many, many months was put on hold. Luckily for us, after 5 months, when the company settled down and the interim CEO, who had been a part of all of our deal discussions and we had a great relationship with, we did move forward and we did close the deal in February after the incident that had happened. And it was very tragic for the company. This incident then put the company in play, and they were purchased by another company. And this was a generic company. We were a novel pharmaceutical product. They were a generic company. This was definitely not a strategic fit for them. So they gave us the rights to the product back after all of this work and getting the deal. But again, because we had great relationships with other people that I had talked to through the rounds of potential partnerships, I was then able to get a final exit for the product with another pharmaceutical company that we had talked to. So just expect the unexpected, work through the issues, and build those relationships, because relationships really, really matter.
What I'd love to do is turn it over for a little Q&A at this point. So please continue to type your questions into the question box on the GoToWebinar interface. And Steve, I'll ask if you would, could you pick a few of the questions that have came in during our discussion that you think are most interesting or imperative?
I will do that. Thank you. Let me first just thank you, Caroline, for leading this very rich and informative discussion, and Wendy, Rick, and Robert for you guys sharing your personal experiences, the challenges, your observations and suggestions in taking a company from founding to a successful exit. As Caroline just mentioned, we have a number of questions which I'll go through, but it's not too late to still submit some questions if you want to do that. We'll try to cover everything, but if we don't get to all of them, we'll certainly forward the unanswered questions onto the panel and collect the responses, and the panel can then respond to you individually. Okay, there's a question here, and I think this touches on a comment that Wendy made. How do you mesh the concept of time is money with the relatively long timelines of obtaining non-dilutive grant funding? It can take a year to get SBIR money.
Yes, yeah, that's a really, go ahead.
Yeah, I just say it'd take at least a year to get SBIR money, longer for, R01 if you're in a university partnership. So it's a good perspective. I think why most of these adventures will be chasing private equity early on. Kind of mirroring a little bit of what Wendy said earlier, when we were initially starting up, we knew we were in a race. There were 3 or 4 technologies that were chasing the same clinical market. We were one of those, had a lead on us by about a year, maybe a year and a half. So for us, there was really no decision to be made. We knew we needed private capital in a hurry if we were going to catch up or have a prayer of crossing the finish line at a reasonable time, considering the other players.
Great,
Wendy,
thank you.
Comment?
Go ahead, Steve, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just wanted to find out if Wendy had anything to add to that.
No, I'm completely in agreement. We are doing things in parallel, and in fact, we had gotten word that we were getting an SBIR grant of $2 million, and then during the election, all funds at NIH were put on hold, so it took another year to get that $2 million. So you can never just hope that that's going to come, and so you've got to really go out and get the investors to invest so that you can really take the products through talks and through human trials so that you can get to an exit.
There are a couple of targeted questions to specific panelists. This one's for Robert. How did you find the professors, or how did the professors find you to work together on the technology?
So I had known them from, so it was funny because the company, after I left Merck, I went to another biotech company, and they were doing some research that was akin to the research our company is doing. So I developed a relationship with those professors at the University. When the company imploded, I approached them and said, you know, because the chemist in particular was prolific. He had over 100 patents to his name, and they already had a significant amount of NIH funding behind them. And so together we pieced the company together, and we thought it would be a good idea. So we had known each other previously.
Here's a question for the panel that Caroline, maybe you want to direct it. It seems you all had previous successful exits that gave you enough cash to take risk with a new startup. How do startups attract CEOs when they have no money to pay them? How do CEOs pay for their cost of living expenses? It's probably a very practical situation.
Yeah, I'll just address that real quick and say that, you know, everybody's got to put skin in the game, you know, that people want to know that you're putting skin in the game. So if you need a CEO that needs to get paid and you have no money, he's not or she's not the right CEO for you. So, you know, like what Wendy said, she did consulting for 2 years with the company. And, you know, I think in my first venture, we were able to raise money right away from high net worth individuals to pay my salary and to pay, you know, salaries for the professors that worked a day a week and to provide, you know, legal fees. So it's really difficult. You got to put sweat equity in at some point in life, but everybody takes a huge pay cut from where they were in big pharma to be able to do this, because at the end of the day, it's all, you make your money on the exit.
I would, this is Rick, I would disagree though with the question's initial premise that everybody has this, you know, treasure trove from an earlier exit for subsequent. In my case is all three. Not true. Well, a little bit true in the last one, but in the first two, not true at all. And yes, it's very concerning when you see your American Express balance, you know, break the $100,000 mark. So that is quite worrisome and nerve-wracking, along with earning, you know, half or less of what you would make at a Fortune 500 company. So I think the first piece in there is it's not for everybody. It's neither path is right or wrong. It's just what's right and tolerable for you, and that is why most all of these startups begin, as Robert said, with a couple high net worth individuals who buy into the story. And as an entrepreneur, you have to go out and find those individuals, be a really good storyteller backed by science, and convince somebody to pony up a couple $100,000 so you can get it off the ground. And that's just hard work, but how these things start.
There's another question here. A lot of these are on the funding side, but I'll do with this one more funding question and then go to some of the other types of questions. This one is, if you don't have a pre-existing network of high net worth individuals to tap into, is there a way for a founder to engage such people? Or is it just networking?
Sometimes it's good, as Robert said, to partner with a foundation, like the Michael J. Fox Foundation, or in my case, there were 3 foundations for celiac disease. There's foundations for type 1 diabetes. Some of those groups have funding and can get you to a bit of a place where you can do certain things financially, and that's a really nice way. The foundations are really usually supportive, and in my case in Baltimore, there are some local ones that are very supportive of things that are going to stay in the state and stay right there, and they will support and fund you as well.
There's also, you know, all around the country, there's angel networks, and some are more well organized than others. But those are where the high net worth individuals, those are kind of organized high net worth individuals, so to speak, but a lot of times they invest individually. But you know, if you look around, and there's actually pretty much every state has a couple. And then the other thing is there's meetings that are out there that you can go to, conferences that you can present at, and a lot of times they're not that expensive to do that, but at least it gets you out there, gets your name going, and shows what you have, and from there you network and try to build that that base of early investors. But you know, as Rick had said, it's really difficult, but it's obviously not impossible.
I wanted to ask this one question that came in and add to it a little bit. The question was, how is the investment from friends and family protected from dilution by later stage financing? And I'd just like to expand on that as well as founders, not just friends and family, but founders as well.
It's not. I mean, as simple as that. I mean, I don't think it's unusual for early agreements, operating agreements, or university license agreements to have a protected party in there. It's very popular in university licenses where the university is protected against dilution maybe through perpetuity, but usually through, you know, a Series A or something like that. And you may think you will protect yourself also, but that's, in my humble single view of the world's silliness, because if your Series A investors coming in with $2.5 million and you have a negotiated pre-money, post-money value, to think that somebody deserves unusual protection, it's just, I don't think it's going to happen. And what the focus should be on is escalating pre and post money values, so that though you own a little bit less in each successive dilutive round, the company valuation goes from 2 million to 7 million to 15 and on to the stars. But that's where you win. You, in my opinion, you don't win by trying to protect dilution, because that's where your Series A or B investor says goodbye.
I think in the time that we have remaining, that I'd like to see if we can get two, to me, interesting questions in. One is, can you talk about managing reduced scientific founder influence as the company moves down the development path? If you've run into that, that's probably good to know as well.
So Robert, perhaps you could talk about that a little bit on how the scientific founder, what they should expect to experience along the way, and how it changes.
Yeah, I think, well, it depends on the scientific founder, right? I think if you've got a good relationship with the scientific founder, they're adding value, then, you know, they don't lose influence. You know, they maintain their influence, and they become, you know, the chief scientific officer of the company, and as the company grows and builds management, they build with it. That's one scenario. Another scenario is where you have, say, professors who don't plan on taking a full-time position, you know, and most professors are allowed to use a day a week or more as consulting. I think then generally, as the company kind of evolves and moves away from their sweet spot, which is, you know, really early stage research, then it's just natural that they lose their influences, and they realize, hopefully they'll realize that. But, you know, they don't know anything about regulatory affairs. They really don't know about designing clinical trials, and so in my case, it's just a natural evolution of the company.
One, maybe the last one here is, all speakers address the frequent need to pivot, especially if appropriate opportunities arise. What are your opinions on platform technologies that from the outset have multiple applications, and it is not always apparent to which applications to begin with?
I think, you know,
that's a real, go ahead.
I'll just, like, I think, you know, I don't personally like platform technologies. And that's just a personal opinion. It doesn't mean they're not good. It's that, I feel, again, I came out of big pharma. I'm very comfortable with, product plays because that's really my comfort zone. And, there's a kind of an endpoint that's very understandable. With platforms, you've got to really figure out what direction to go and how do you monetize it. So my preference is to stay with, not a platform, but more of a, product opportunities. And that's really just because of my comfort zone. Wendy?
And I would totally agree with you, Robert, again, coming from Merck. And when you think about an exit, you have to have a product you can sell. And you can't test that product for all of these different indications and think that you're going to get multiple partners for the different indications. One company will want one product that does what it does very well. It may have a second indication, but you must have IP and very good data on one product for what its condition is treating. And then if you have a second area, like I have with a different therapeutic area, make sure those are different products with different IP, different preclinical data, different clinical data, et cetera. Because a company is not going to buy a platform, just as Robert said, they're going to buy a product or 2 or 3 products or 4 products, whatever you may have. And having backup compounds is also good to that lead product or second lead product. That also helps. But be sure that you're just focusing on the IP of that product and have a product that you can sell.
Okay. We're just, I'm sorry, Caroline, go ahead.
No, I was just doing the same thing you do. I think do we have time just for some quick closing comments from each of the panelists?
Yeah, absolutely, yes, please.
So Wendy, do you want to start?
Sure. I guess my takeaway is get the best scientific technology you can get that fulfills an unmet medical need. It's going to take you many years to get this product out there, and be sure you can help patients and save lives. And if you're passionate about the product, you have a really good management team and great investors, you'll then achieve the best exit for your product to be taken to the next level.
Robert?
Yeah, I think Wendy said it all there. That was a great one. I think, at the end of the day, building a company is not easy, but it's incredibly fulfilling. I would never have changed anything I've done in that sense. So it's, but be ready for a battle, be ready for scars on your back. But at the end of the day, it's well worth doing, and follow the rules that Wendy just mentioned, and I think, you could have a good outcome.
Ditto, not a lot to add. Just make sure the dog can hunt before you train it and invest in it, and be ready for a long, hard journey. But for me, I find that journey to be fun, and work should be fun.
And Caroline?
I always think it's interesting to hear about how much work it is and how many different perspectives have to bring in. Everybody thinks it's all about the science when things are just starting, but there's so many other pieces and so many other skill sets that really contribute to a successful company and getting it from the initial scientific concepts all the way through the exit.
Caroline, Wendy, Robert, and Rick, thank you again for today's great discussion and for the time and effort you've put into preparing for it. There's a slide on the screen right now with everybody's contact info. If you don't have a chance to write it down, I'll put it back up right after the closing slide so you can take a picture of the screen. There are a few people that have asked questions about getting copies of the slides. They will be made available for downloading, and a recording of this web panel should be available for viewing on ShareVault's website, both in the next few days. So on behalf of the panel, Women in Bio, and ShareVault, I'd like to thank our audience for your time and questions. And depending on where you're located, I just want to wish everybody a very good afternoon, evening, or night. And thanks again to the panel and Caroline for organizing this, this event.